Part 10. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 102. Shen Yu pursed her lips and said, I'm afraid I'll hurt you. Smooth words and charming words. Xieting Zhou scolded, but his eyes suddenly softened. You only know the way forward but don't know how to deal with the aftermath. You still need someone to wipe it for you. Wipe your ass. Shen Yu continued what he had left unfinished. Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes and looked at her. She was just over his shoulders, and she was still a little girl who hadn't fully grown yet. The aftermath has been taken care of for you. It's just that you go to Bazin Academy one after another. People there must already know you. Stay away from home in the short term to avoid being spotted. Shen Yu responded obediently, walked closer, and said, I have one more thing to ask. Xieting Zhou, what's the matter? There was a big fuss today. Are those students okay? Although she dragged those students into this relationship, she was not a cold-hearted person after all, and she was somewhat worried about their safety. What do you think? Xieting Zhou glanced sideways at her. How can the emperor be so easy to control? Thousands of students forced him to give orders. Which emperor can swallow such a breath? But Shen Yu frowned and said, once the emperor orders punishment, it will definitely arouse public outrage. Xieting Zhou couldn't help but take a closer look at her. It could be seen that she was not careless, but had considered it carefully. Emperor Tongxue didn't give the order, and some people took care of him. The commander of the imperial army ordered several leading students to be taken, and each of them was hit with 20 big sticks to kill chickens and monkeys, and then go back and apologize to the emperor. Shen Yu gritted her teeth. The emperor raised a good dog. Not only did he help Emperor Tongxue bite someone, but Emperor Tongxue only needed a symbolic punishment to disassociate himself from it. What exactly did you say to those students? Xieting Zhou asked. They didn't back down despite such threats. Shen Yu said, you may not believe it, but I didn't say any inflammatory words. I just told some of what I saw and heard at the border. It's not an incitement, but a sense of justice in the hearts of those students. Although illiterati cannot go into battle to kill the enemy, a literati's pen is like a warrior's sword, sometimes even sharper than the sword. How can students just sit idly by and ignore the situation in the great Zhou dynasty? Xieting Zhou nodded in agreement. Those who achieve great things will only stagnate if they get stuck in trivial matters. But what great things can I accomplish? Shen Yu made a small tisk sound in distress, then lay on the table and said, you think it's strange or not, my father always said in his dreams that I can save more people, but I don't know who else I can save. Xieting Zhou said, what a coincidence, a senior monk once said the same thing to me. Really? Shen Yu asked in surprise, did you save him? Xieting Zhou glanced at her, how many times do you think I saved you? Shen Yu curled her lips, Your Highness's great kindness, Shen Yu has nothing to repay. Xieting Zhou snorted softly, you can't retaliate, so you're not going to retaliate. He walked slowly to the bookshelf, and ran his fingertips across the bookshelf one by one. Those fingers are as slender as jade, and there are thin calluses between them. It looks like he is pampered. It's not that I won't repay. Shen Yu looked away from his hand, thought for a moment and said, it's just that you lack nothing, but I don't have much, so I don't know what I can give you. Xieting Zhou stopped stroking his fingers and looked sideways. How do you know that what you have is not what I want? Yes, Xieting Zhou stared into her eyes intently. As the saying goes, one should pledge one's body to someone without expecting anything in return. If she pledged one's body to someone else, she would feel that she was taking advantage of Xieting Zhou. Shen Yu's eyes rolled slightly, and after thinking for a moment, she nodded heavily, I understand. What do you understand? Shen Yu said a little embarrassedly, but I can't give it to you now. Xieting Zhou's breathing became lighter and he felt a little nervous. He explained, I am not forcing you to repay a favor. I understand, Shen Yu said, it's just that I don't have many banknotes with me now, and His Highness Xiao Qian will definitely look down on him. Shenjing's shop is also inconvenient for withdrawing large sums of money. When I send a letter to repair the book. Shen Yu, Xieting Zhou warned. Shen Yu was confused, what's wrong? Xieting Zhou sneered, how much money are you going to use to reward me? Shen Yu said seriously, no amount of money can repay His Highness's great kindness. I am going to give you 1 million taels as a reward. If you don't like it, you can go up. Ms. Shen's offer is millions. How dare I be too little for such a big deal? How much is a million? During the Kaiping period, the annual tax revenue of the Great Zhou dynasty was 15 million taels to 20 million taels. That was the heyday of the Great Zhou dynasty, which was already a grand occasion 200 years ago. Today, one day is worse than the other. Last year, the tax revenue for the entire year was less than 5 million taels, and the national treasury was in a huge deficit. She opened her mouth and asked for 1 million taels of silver. 1 million taels could support many soldiers on the border. This shows how rich the Lu family in Hezhu has become. Shen Yu was not stupid. She could hear the kindness of his words and said with a smile, it's just a small family fortune. Xieting Zhou raised his hand and pressed his eyebrows. Do you have a headache again? Shen Yu asked quickly. Yes, it gave her a headache and made her angry. Xieting Zhou felt that he needed to take a moment. How could such a smart person be like a piece of wood now? Do you want to call the doctor? Xieting Zhou, no need. Shen Yu felt relieved when she saw that Xieting Zhou didn't look bad, and looked a little better. My grandmother also often suffers from headaches. The doctor said this is what happens when people get older. Xieting Zhou put down his hand, are you trying to comfort me or are you mocking my age? Shen Yu quickly explained, I didn't mean that. Xieting Zhou breathed out and looked out the window. It had rained frequently in Shenjing in the past few days, and the open tiles on the windows were covered with moisture. He raised his hand and touched the bookshelf again, and casually pulled out a book from it. Shen Yu raised her eyelids and glanced at it. When she lowered her eyes, she suddenly remembered that something was wrong. The Spring Palace pictures she had placed were still inside. Who knew which one Xieting Zhou had drawn? Don't, turn over! Shen Yu shouted loudly. Everything in front of her seemed to have slowed down. She saw that Xieting Zhou's slender jade-like fingers had already opened the pages of the book, and then his cold eyelids slowly raised and he looked towards her. As soon as Xieting Zhou opened the book, he saw a figure jumping from above supporting the desk. Xieting Zhou subconsciously felt something was wrong. When Shen Yu reached out to grab the book, he raised his hand and asked, what are you doing? Shen Yu looked up in panic at the book that was out of her reach. This book is not good. Xieting Zhou half smiled, why is this book so bad? This book is damp and has not been dried. I will dry it later and show it to you. Shen Yu wanted to grab it, but Xieting Zhou hid the book behind his back. When she moved to the left, he hid it to the right, and when she moved to the right, he hid it to the left. Xieting Zhou intuitively felt that the book was not that simple. He lifted it up and opened a page at random, looking down at her with a smile. Shen Yu didn't dare to raise her head, thinking that she was being embarrassed, so she heard Xieting Zhou ask, are you worried that I'll laugh at you for reading a script? Shen Yu suddenly raised her head, was stunned for a moment and then nodded, yeah, I'm afraid you'll laugh at me for not doing my job properly. Xieting Zhou flipped through 2 pages at random, closed the book and put it back on the bookshelf. Shen Yu breathed a sigh of relief, worried that Xieting Zhou would continue to mess up, so she quickly poured a cup of tea from the table and handed it over. Your Highness has tea. Xieting Zhou took it and glanced at the teacup. If you show your courtesy for nothing, you are either cheating or stealing. Is it poisoned or do you want to ask for something? Is there no other possibility? Xieting Zhou raised his eyelids and asked, what other possibilities are there? For example. Shen Yu said in a long tone, for example, the tea is cold, which means I am chasing guests. The azure figure turned around and disappeared at the door in the blink of an eye. He was not seen holding the tea bowl, and a smile escaped from his throat. No rules and no rules. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 103. At 5 o'clock in the yin hour, before dawn, the court officials began to come to court one after another. There are 3 palace gates, and court officials should dismount in front of the first gate. The first assistant, Zhang Yuanqing, was already in high status, and Emperor Tongxue granted him permission to enter the palace by carriage. However, Zhang Yuanqing was a meticulous man and regarded etiquette as his destiny. He never received preferential treatment and walked to Suanhui Hall with other court officials every day. Zhang Lianzi personally helped Zhang Yuanqing get off the carriage. Zhang Yuanqing raised his eyes and saw a dark place kneeling in front of the palace gate. These students have been kneeling in court since yesterday. Some of them fell down because they couldn't hold on anymore. They have been helped down, leaving some sparse gaps in between. Zhang Yuanqing had tried to persuade him during the court session yesterday, but they didn't listen. Zhang Yuanqing shook his head, broke away from Zhang Lianzi's hand, and walked towards the palace gate with his back straight. Lord Chief Assistant. Suddenly there was a shout from the crowd. Zhang Yuanqing turned around and raised his hand to stop Zhang Lianzi, who was about to speak. His eyes were calm and majestic as he swept across the crowd. One person in the crowd got up from the ground. His legs were numb from kneeling for too long. He staggered over, picked up his robe and knelt down again 3 feet away from Zhang Yuanqing. Master Chief Assistant, the student straightened his back and raised his head and said, the great Zhou has stood for hundreds of years and produced countless heroic generals. Their blood spilled on the borders and their bones and blood built the copper and iron walls of the great Zhou. A few months after Yan Liangwen was defeated, the souls of hundreds of thousands of heroes could not rest in peace. The students were protected by them. The traitor could not be seen for a day, and the students could not sleep at night. Now the students are here to kneel down and ask the Holy One to give justice to 100,000 heroic souls. Zhang Yuanqing said in a deep voice, Your Majesty will investigate this case thoroughly. You are here now to persecute the Holy One. The student raised his head and said, since the investigation was thorough and the traitor was imprisoned for more than a month, why has there been no movement? Zhang Yuanqing was silent. He mentioned this matter during the cabinet discussion, but His Majesty did not respond. The Emperor's heart is unpredictable. Even they, veterans who have followed him for many years, cannot figure out what Emperor Tongxue is thinking. The student said angrily, please open your eyes and see the crumbling state of Zhou dynasty. Be careful what you say, Zhang Yuanqing yelled angrily. If traitors and sycophants are in power, if they are not severely punished, where will the national law exist? The students behind him were filled with indignation, where does the national law exist? Zhang Yuanqing scolded him coldly, do you know what it is to try to influence the Holy Emperor's decision? Students know. Zhang Yuanqing frowned, and when he saw the student slowly getting up, he suddenly felt something was wrong. Warriors fight to the death, General Shen is at the forefront, students are willing to use their flesh and blood to awaken thousands of sleeping people. Zhang Yuanqing's eyes widened angrily, stop him. The sky was getting brighter, and a person hurriedly rushed outside Qingpu House. Is Your Highness awake? The visitor asked. The guard followed him through the door and said, Your Highness slept late last night. I wonder if he woke up. Walking into the courtyard, 11 Feng under the eaves looked at each other and then turned around and knocked on the door lightly. Your Highness, there is news from the palace. Xieting's whose lazy voice came from inside the house, come in. Xieting Zhou had just woken up and had not yet gotten up. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his robe gathered up. The secret guards are also divided into different positions, some are responsible for protecting security, and some are responsible for collecting intelligence. The person who came is the secret guard responsible for intelligence. The secret guard knelt down on one knee. Those students stayed together all night last night. When going to court this morning, a student stopped Zhang Yuanqing, the chief minister, outside the palace gate. After an impassioned speech, he bumped his head to death outside the palace gate. Xie Ting's whose hand pinching his eyebrows suddenly stopped. What then? The secret guard continued, when entering the second gate, another student from the Imperial College was hit and killed. Xie Ting's whose breathing became heavy and he didn't speak for a while. The secret guard said, Your Majesty was so angry that he fell down. He ordered the imperial physician to go to court today and ordered the court to examine him tomorrow morning. Palace trial means bringing the case to Fengtian Palace for trial, and the emperor and all court officials will hear the case together. This means that Emperor Tongxue compromised with thousands of scholars. Several people's voices sounded in the courtyard. Xie Tingzhou heard one of the voices, frowned and said, Let her in. Shen Yu stepped through the door, and Xie Tingzhou had already stood up, gathered his clothes and walked out from behind the screen. Come to the palace for questioning tomorrow morning. Shen Yu's eyes widened. The emperor just compromised like this? What happened? Xie Tingzhou looked at her. The two students remonstrated to death and their blood was spilled on Jingtianmen. Shen Yu was stunned for a moment, and her eyelashes slowly lowered. Xie Tingzhou stared at her face and waved his hand. Zifeng and the dark guard immediately retreated. Xie Tingzhou said leisurely, You don't have to blame yourself for this. The foundation of the great Zhou dynasty for hundreds of years has long been rotten. Corrupt officials are rampant and there are thousands of refugees everywhere. Do you think the students don't understand? Yan Liangwen won the case is just an introduction. Those students are not just admonishing Yan Liangwen, they are admonishing loyalty. Shen Yu turned her head and looked at Xie Tingzhou. In fact, she was calmer than she thought. The case has been delayed until now. Is it unclear or impossible to investigate? Or is it that the results of the investigation cannot be made public? Xie Tingzhou's eyes moved and he looked back at her. The two of them saw an unspoken understanding in each other's eyes. Shen Yu walked over, raised her head and said, Since Emperor Tongxue ordered the trial tomorrow, it means that the case has been concluded. But why has it been delayed until now? What is the result that made him delay it until now despite the public opinion? We'll know the result tomorrow. Xie Tingzhou comforted, It's futile to guess too much now. Shen Yu nodded, her thoughts calmed down a bit, and then she thought of the two students who were stubbornly admonishing her. I want to give some compensation to the families of those two students. I said that it was their choice to retaliate, and you don't need to blame yourself, Xie Tingzhou said. Shen Yu shook her head and said, I don't blame myself. Everyone has their own ambitions. I just stated my actual views on border issues and did not exaggerate them in the slightest. I admire them for their willingness to serve the country with benevolence, so I am also willing to contribute to their behalf. They take care of the families. Xie Tingzhou nodded slowly, walked to the window and looked at the green courtyard. The strong wind blew through the forest, bringing with it a chilling air. Just watch. Xie Tingzhou's eyes were serious. Today's remonstrance is just the beginning. De Zhou's fig leaf is about to be torn apart. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 104. On the 10th day of February in the 18th year of Tongxue, this was the first palace trial since the first year of Tongxue. The sun has just appeared, and all the civil and military officials are going to court. Xie Tingzhou stood in the hall and looked back. Ge Liangji, the former Minister of Household Affairs, was taken to the Suanhui Hall. The days in prison had tortured him into a human shape, and he was heavily shackled. When he entered the hall, he broke away from the jailer who was holding him, and still straightened his back. Stepped in. This was the last time Ge Liangji entered the Suanhui Hall in his life, and he knew this very well. The palace trial began, and all the officials in the palace were horrified by the accusations made one after another by the minister of Dali Temple. The former Minister of Household Affairs, Ge Liangji, colluded with the traitor Liangji Unfang, killed Zhong Liang and led to the defeat of Yan Liang Pass. Do you admit it or not? Ge Liangji kowtowed and said, yes. On the 10th day of September in the 17th year of Tongxu, General Shen Zhongan of Hussars and General Shen Zhao of Yunhui led their troops to Yan Liang Pass. You bribed Liangji Unfang and told him that he would definitely lose this battle, so you colluded with Zihu and revealed that our army report and formation map. Is this possible? No one in the hall answered, everyone looked at Ge Liangji. Is this possible? The voice of the minister of Dali Temple echoed in the hall. Ge Liangji slowly raised his head, his chapped lips slightly opened, and said firmly, no. The whole hall was in an uproar. Even Yu Hongii, the minister of Dali Temple, was shocked. He didn't expect that Ge Liangji would dare to retract his confession in court. He turned his head and wanted to look at the throne above the main hall. He held back, just tilted his head slightly, and looked at Ge Liangji again. Everyone's eyes were on Ge Liangji, who retracted his confession in court, and no one noticed his action except Xieting Zhou. Xieting Zhou looked at Emperor Tongxu who was sitting on the throne. The elderly Emperor Tongxu pursed his lips and glared angrily at Ge Liangji who was kneeling below. Invisible pressure was released in his eyes, just like everyone else in the palace. Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes and hid the emotions in his eyes. Ge Liangji raised his head and looked at the throne, and suddenly raised his voice, Your Majesty, the sinner Ge Liangji has left a guilty note. I hope your Majesty will allow me to present it myself. Emperor Tongxu said, accurate. Ge Liangji said, on the 10th day of September in the 17th year of Tongxu, General Shen Zhongan of the cavalry and General Shen Zhao of the Yunhui led their troops to Yan Liang Pass. I have been enemies with Shen Zhongan and his son for many years, and I think this is a good opportunity to get rid of him. So we joined forces with Liangji Unfang to devise a plan. Yu Hongii asked, what enmity do you have with General Shen? Ge Liangji said, the enmity I have made is detailed in the Book of Guilt, so I won't waste your Majesty's and your Lord's time in the palace. But I did not collude with the Zihu people. I just asked Liangji Unfang to add medicine to the food and grass. Who knows, there was a problem with the food and grass on the road, and it was late, which caused the plan to fail, so Liangji Unfang took it upon himself to collude with the Zihu people. This plan was also discovered, and he had to close the door. Originally, if this battle is defeated, it only needs to be blamed on the Zihu people. Liangji Unfang only needs to say that closing the city and locking the gates is to protect the people in the pass. This plan must be foolproof. Who knows that Prince Balin has arrived with King Yun guards? I was worried that the matter would be exposed, so I set up an ambush on the way to the capital. I thought I had killed Liangji Unfang, but I didn't know that Liangji Unfang had been sent to the capital by another way by the prince. The statement was closely connected with the incident, and there were no loopholes. In addition, Liangji Unfang was dead, and it seemed that no one could be found to refute him. Yu Hongii, the minister of Dali Temple, asked in a deep voice, do you have any other accomplices? Ge Liangji was silent for a moment. In just this moment, needles could be heard in the hall, and even his breathing became lighter. No, this case was a conspiracy between myself and Liangji Unfang, and there were no other accomplices. Xieting Zhou seemed to hear the sound of someone exhaling in the palace. At some point, it started to rain outside the palace. The towering pavilion blocked the rain, but Xietingzhou seemed to see the filth in the palace soaking into the ground, turning the beams and columns of Suanhui Pavilion into a rotten color. The bottom of this building is rotten. Is it going to collapse? Why is it still standing tall and lingering? The spring rain gradually turned into heavy rain, and the palace trial came to an end. Officials' attendants were not allowed to come in. After retreating from the court, many officials were escorted out of Chengtian Gate through Xiaohuang Gate. Some of them were not in a hurry and stood outside Suanhui Hall watching the torrential rain. Zhang Lianzi helped Zhang Yuanqing get on the carriage. "Grandpa, please go back first." Zhang Yuanqing seemed to have something to say, but he just sighed, blending all the unfinished words into that breath. There is no need to say anything, both grandfather and grandson understand the meaning. Zhang Lianzi looked back at the high wall of the palace gate, and saw a man walking out of Chengtian Gate in the pouring rain, followed by a guard holding an umbrella. The man was wearing a crow blue beanie, and when he looked through the rain curtain, his eyes were indescribably cold. Xietingzhou is the prince of Balan, and the regulations are different, and his attendants can follow him into the palace. Seeing Zhang Lianzi, Xietingzhou paused slightly, then walked straight to Zhang Lianzi. "Master Zhang seems to be quite troubled." Zhang Lianzi turned to look at the palace gate and said politely, "It's just a trivial matter." "I'm worried about it, Prince Lao." Xietingzhou looked at him. "It seems that Mr. Zhang is dissatisfied today." "How dare you?" Zhang Lianzi looked at him. "Your Majesty, the holy judge, how dare you be dissatisfied as a minister?" Xietingzhou smiled and walked a few steps forward. When he passed by, he said leisurely, "I mean, Mr. Zhang is not dissatisfied with me for being a step late when I arrived at Yanliang Pass." Zhang Lianzi's pupils shrank sharply and he suddenly looked back. Xietingzhou had left with a smile, leaving only his scattered back in the rain curtain. Zhang Lianzi felt uneasy. He looked at Xietingzhou's back and said in a deep voice, "He knows that the letter sent to Balan came from me." Gao Jin said, "I wonder if he just found out, or did he know it for a long time and didn't say anything until now?" Zhang Lianzi's eyes darkened. He should have known it a long time ago, but he just kept it secret. Today, he saw it. Today's verdict is favorable to Zhang Lianzi. Once the former Minister of Household Affairs was overthrown, he was the only one left in charge. However, there was no joy on his face and his eyes were full of sorrow. So maybe Xietingzhou was just testing, because he couldn't figure out the purpose of Zhang Lianzi's letter. Gao Jin helped Zhang Lian get into the carriage. "My lord, let me say one more thing. Since your lord wanted to write that letter to remind you, why didn't you just say it directly or submit it to the emperor?" Zhang Lianzi didn't answer, and the car curtain lowered. He leaned against the shaking car wall and thought, why? Because he was too greedy. He wanted Au to marry him smoothly just like in his previous life, but he was also afraid that she would be too sad and that he would have a guilty conscience. So this is the result of the struggle. He has worked hard, Zhang Lianzi told himself. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 105. As soon as it rained, Emperor Tongxiu's paralysis syndrome occurred again. The imperial doctors came and went, but they could only temporarily relieve the pain with acupuncture. "I'm old," Emperor Tongxiu said, leaning on the pillow. Defu said hurriedly, "Your Majesty is at the height of his power now, and the world still depends on you to support it." Emperor Tongxiu shook his head and said sadly, "I can't hold it anymore. When the late emperor entrusted Dazhu to me, it was already in a mess. I can't hold it anymore. I can't hold it anymore." Defu didn't dare to accept these words, so he held the ginseng tea and handed it over. "Your Majesty, moisten your throat first." Emperor Tongxiu took it, put the cup to his lips, and put it down again. Now this result can be considered as comforting, but people in the world may not be willing to buy it. Defu said, "My maid, Yunu, your majesty doesn't care whether the people in the world buy it or not. It's impossible for everyone to buy it. Find some literati to lead the way, and it will naturally calm down." Emperor Tongxue picked up the teacup and took a sip. "I still have to give some grace to the Shen family. Who else is there in the Shen family now? It's also miserable. Now only Mrs. Shen and Miss Shen are left. It is said that Mrs. Shen went crazy for no reason a few days ago." Emperor Tongxue sighed, "There are only orphans and widows left, and I can't be given an official position. Please give me a royal title. It's a crazy person, so it's difficult to handle." "This matter is not difficult to handle," Defu said with a smile. "I am willing to share your worries for your majesty." "Tell me." Emperor Tongxue put down the teacup. Defu said, "A woman must marry well to be considered good. Can't your majesty just point out a marriage for her?" Emperor Tongxue nodded. "It makes sense, but is your majesty wondering what kind of family is suitable for marriage? If you criticize me too low, you will definitely say that I have wronged Zhongli. If you criticize me too high, she may not be willing to marry you. No matter how much grace is given, the Shen family has already been defeated. There is no one in the mother's family, so there is no help to the husband's family, and those with higher family status will probably complain." Defu smiled and said, "Now there is someone who can take care of His Majesty's worries. Your Majesty has been in confinement for a long time, so he probably has not heard the rumors from the outside world. In September last year, before General Shen went on an expedition, Mrs. Zhang came to propose marriage to Mr. Zhang, the Minister of Household Affairs. And the result was rejected. Is there anyone who would reject Zhang Ji?" Emperor Tongxue turned to look at Defu in surprise. Defu nodded. "Master Zhang is a person who values love and justice. When something like this happened to the Shen family, Master Zhang once said that as long as Miss Shen is willing to marry, he can marry her at any time. Is this happening?" Defu nodded. "Last time Princess Ruimin entered the palace, she also talked about this matter with the Queen Mother, saying that Miss Shen refused to marry because she felt she was not worthy of Mr. Zhang. There was actually quite a bit of admiration in the conversation. If your Majesty spoke, it's a beautiful thing." Emperor Tongxue suddenly became enlightened. The Zhang family was powerful. If Zhang Lianzi was given a young lady with a high family status, he would be worried about the powerful alliance between the two families. After his funeral, the prince might not be able to hold him back. The rain outside the window made a swishing sound in the bamboo forest. Xietingzhou took off his court clothes, changed into regular clothes, and walked to Lumingxian holding an umbrella. Arya moved a small bench and sat under the eaves with De Wang to watch the rain. "Where's Shizhi?" Xietingzhou asked. Arya stood up and straightened her clothes. Shiju always said that she played with De Wang all day long, almost like a little beggar. "Brother Shizhi went out at dawn and hasn't come back yet." Xietingzhou was silent. She must be anxious to know the outcome of today's palace trial, so she went early to wait. As soon as the palace trial was over, Emperor Tongxue issued an edict. Liang Jianfang colluded with 11 Zhu. Even if he died, his hatred could not be relieved, and the 9 tribes were punished as a warning to others. Ji Liangji was executed, the Shangshu mansion ransacked his family, and the officials' family members were turned into prostitutes. Except for the children under 3 years old, the rest of the Ge family, more than 1,000 people, were all exiled. Whether the punishment is serious or light, Ge Liangji must have retracted his confession in court in order to achieve such a result. The crime of colluding with the Western Jew was pushed onto a dead man. Could the dead man get up and reverse the case? "When she comes back, let her go to Qingpiju." After Xietingzhou said that, he turned around and left. It was getting dark, and the maid came in to light the lamp. Xietingzhou asked, "Isn't she back yet?" The maid bent down and replied, "I don't know, I'm going to ask someone to come in." No, no, no. Chang Liu arrived before he could say anything, and even before he stepped through the door, he said, I've gone to Lu Mingxian 4 or 5 times, but Shizhi never came back. Xie Zhou turned his head and glanced out the window. This spring rain seems to be endless. It has been falling since morning and still has no intention of stopping. She should be speechless and powerless about today's outcome. Shen Yu didn't come back until it got dark. The bluestone pavement on the street was filled with water. When the clerk of the clothing store heard the knock on the door, he got up from the bed and went to open the door. He was holding an oil lamp in his hand, and through the crack in the door he saw a carriage parked outside, with several mounted guards accompanying him on both sides. The clerk had gone to Balin Palace to deliver something, and he recognized that it was the carriage from Balin Palace. He hurriedly opened the door and saw a tall man wearing a bamboo hat standing at the door. Zifeng asked, Is your young master here? The waiter said, Young master is not here. He hasn't been here today. 11 Fen nodded, turned back to the carriage and reported back to the window. The group of people did not move at the door, waiting for the master's order, and the waiter did not dare to close the door. After a while, I heard the person in the car say, Get out of the city. The clerk couldn't help but said, The city gates are closed now, I'm afraid I won't be able to get out. The people in the carriage didn't reply to him. The carriage drove past the store door, and the curtain of the carriage suddenly lifted. If she comes, let her go home and wait for me. The waiter nodded hurriedly and stared at that godlike face for a long time without regaining consciousness. The horses' hooves were treading in the rain, and the guards were wearing raincoats, but they were also drenched by the heavy rain. Before they reached the city gate, the gate guard shouted harshly. Stop! The city gate is closed and no one is allowed to pass. The team stopped. 11 Feng clamped his horse's belly and walked a few steps forward, took off his waist badge and threw it over. Prince Balin wants to leave the city, open the city gate quickly. The guard looked suspicious, took the badge and saw that he was indeed from Balin Palace. The guard cupped his hands in front of the carriage and said, Your Highness, I forgive you, but you cannot open the door without the fish talisman. Really, through the spring rain, the voice inside the carriage was not clear. Come here. The guard stepped forward, and as soon as he got close to the carriage, he felt a chill on his neck, and the knife on his neck glowed coldly. Can it be opened now? Xie Zhou asked. The guard didn't dare to move. After thinking for a moment, he slowly raised his hand and gritted his teeth and said, Open the door. The group of people galloped away through the wide open city gate. The guard immediately got on his horse and said, Close the door. I will report to the captain. Shen Yu walked down the mountain road. The rain gradually became lighter, and her umbrella had been blown to nowhere. Raindrops poured all over her face, so she wiped her face and continued walking down the mountain. After turning around the pine forest, she suddenly stopped and saw a group of people on the path. The torch was almost extinguished by the rain. The man in the middle was holding an umbrella. When he raised his eyes, he also stopped. Bai syndrome, now called Lauhan leg. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Zhizhi. Chapter 106. Shen Yu looked at him for a long time, then she raised her lips and asked, Why are you here? Xie Zhou said warmly, It's raining, I'll pick you up. In an instant, the heavy rain in my heart turned into a continuous spring rain. Shen Yu's lips trembled, the corners of her eyes were sore, and she suddenly wanted to cry. Xie Zhou stepped forward, handed her the umbrella, untied his cloak and put it on her shoulders, took the umbrella back from her hand, grabbed her wrist, and led her down the mountain, his movements so natural. Shen Yu lowered her eyes and saw that his sleeves were so big that they covered their hands. The place where the sleeves met seemed to have a thread drilled into it, spreading along her bloodline and not knowing where it was tied. The carriage stopped at the foot of the mountain. After getting on the carriage, Xie took a closer look at her face. She looked like she had just been fished out of the water, her hair was sticking to her face in wet strands, and her lips were white. It was already spring, and there was no heater in the carriage. The tea on the table had gone cold all the way to find her. "Why don't you know how to hold an umbrella when it rains?" Xie asked. "I was beaten and blown away by the wind." His tone sounded a little aggrieved. As soon as Emperor Tongxue issued the edict, the Yamen posted a notice, and Shen Yu knew the verdict. There is no doubt that Ji Liangji and Liangji Unfang were part of the defeat at Yanliang Pass. Although this case did not go deeper, it finally took a crucial step. They were punished. Shen Yu wanted to tell her father and brother the news, so she left the city and went up the mountain. Later, the mountain wind blew away the umbrella, and she took shelter under a tree. Unexpectedly, the rain got heavier as she waited. The mountain road was rugged, it was rainy, there was no moon, and it was dark. It was difficult to walk on the road. If you accidentally stepped on the air, you might fall off the cliff. She didn't go down the mountain until the rain had subsided. The city gate had been closed long ago. She originally wanted to go down the mountain and find a dilapidated temple to rest for the night, but she didn't expect that Xie would come to pick her up. Xie opened the cabinet under the couch and took out one of his own robes. "Sometimes when I go out to meet friends or guests, I always have a robe in the car in case I spill wine or need to change. Take off your wet clothes and wear this," Xie said and closed his eyes. Shen Yu felt cold all over, and her soaked clothes clung to her body like a layer of wet waterweed, making her feel uncomfortable. She had been soaked in the rain all day and couldn't get warm. It got colder after dark and her head felt dizzy. She looked at Xie. He straightened his back, closed his eyes, and put his hands on his knees, as if he had fallen into trance. She often said that people in the world don't stick to trivial matters. If she cares about these things, it would appear that she is a villain. Besides, there is really no need to be in trouble with her own body. Shen Yu took off her cloak, turned her back, and took off the soaked clothes clinging to her body, leaving the innermost coat on, and put on Xie clothes outside. The middle coat is thin and should be dried by body heat in a short time. "All right." Xie opened his eyes after another moment, and saw her sitting upright, wrapped in his loose robe, as if she was wearing an adult's clothes, which was a bit naughty. Shen Yu asked, "The city gate has been closed for so long, how did your highness get out of the city?" Xie did not reply, but asked, "Have you already known the results of the palace trial?" "I know," Shen Yu nodded and said, "although it is not satisfactory, this result is actually what I expected. Things in the world can never go as planned. Fortunately, there are other clues and we can check them from other places." Xie picked up the cloak and threw it on her. "It's good if you can think about it." Xie originally thought that if she was dissatisfied with the result, she might go to the graves of her father and brother to cry, or she might impulsively do something difficult to end, but she didn't expect that she had already convinced herself. It has only been a few months, and she has grown so fast, which is both gratifying and distressing at the same time. Growth is a process of constant shaping, and she is constantly shaping herself. Shen Yu wrapped her cloak tightly, hugging her knees and huddled up under the cloak. The case was too sloppily concluded. Someone must have been obstructing it and didn't want to involve more people. Xie didn't say what he saw in the palace, but asked, "What do you think?" Shen Yu thought for a while and said, "The robbery of grain and grass seems to have nothing to do with this case. In fact, they should be investigated together as one case. They deliberately separated them, maybe because they were afraid of pulling out the carrots and bringing out the mud. This case is a palace case judgment, no matter who is covering up. Emperor Tongxue has already acquiesced to this result." "Do you think Emperor Tongxue was involved?" Xie asked. The lamp on the table flickered, and her face flickered, and there seemed to be a blush on her face. Shen Yu said, I have thought about this possibility for a long time today. If he is involved, but the series of events contradicts it. Xieting Zhou signaled, speak boldly. Shen Yu frowned and said, only the peaceful emperors in the world are afraid of their great achievements and will shock their master, so they consider killing the donkey. Now that the world is in such chaos and the vassal king is so powerful. Nowadays, Balin is the most powerful among the vassal kings. She paused and added, I'm not targeting you. Shen Jiajin is the sharpest knife in Emperor Tongxiu's hand. If this knife is gone, the person who should feel the most chill is Emperor Tongxiu himself. Xieting Zhou nodded in agreement. Nowadays, there are many difficulties in the DPRK. There are not enough garrison troops at Yanliang Pass. Emperor Tongxiu did not dare to hand over Yanliang Pass to Balin, so he could only mobilize troops from various places to make up for it. The whole body was involved, making it difficult to mobilize troops to suppress the bandits, and it was delayed until the beginning of spring. As her body gradually warmed up, Shen Yu's head began to feel heavy. She calmed down and continued, how could Emperor Tongxiu risk his country? Moreover, even if he wanted to kill the donkey, he would not bury 100,000 soldiers with him in such a childish way. He would definitely make a plan. It's safe, there are hundreds of ways to retain troops. Xieting Zhou said, although Emperor Tongxiu did not take the lead in this matter, he acquiesced. There are taboos that even he, as an emperor, dare not touch, or do not want to touch, or that once revealed will cause violent turmoil in the court. Shen Yu murmured, he is protecting someone, or he wants to desperately hold down De Zhou's fig leaf. Xieting Zhou looked at her sleepy face through the candlelight and was not ready to continue answering. He then saw her forcefully opening her eyes to wake up. Ji Liangji decided to kill him without waiting for the Queen of Autumn. I'm afraid he was just worried about the long nights and dreams, so he wanted to cut off the source here. After all, she couldn't resist the sleepiness, her voice became smaller and gradually, she dropped her head on her knees. After a while, Xieting Zhou estimated that she had fallen asleep, so he reached out to gather her loose cloak. Unexpectedly, with a slight tug, she fell over towards him. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 107. Xieting Zhou hurriedly reached out and fished it out. People who practice martial arts have more sensitive senses than ordinary people. She didn't wake up to such a big movement. Xieting Zhou helped her lean on his legs, lowered his head and called her, Shijie, wake up. Shen Yu had no reaction. Touching her forehead, the tentacles were as hot as red-hot coals. Xieting Zhou frowned, opened the car curtain and asked, how long until we can enter the city? About half an hour. Zifeng looked sideways while riding on the horse. Inside the carriage, Shijie was lying on Xieting Zhou's legs. Xieting Zhou held his back with one hand, almost in a half-hug position. This scene made Zifeng turn his head immediately, not daring to look at it again. Xieting Zhou ordered, speed up. After saying that, he lowered the car curtain. 11 Feng ordered to go down, and the carriage suddenly started to move faster, swaying unsteadily, and Shen Yu also slid down from his legs. Xieting Zhou sighed, hugged her and moved up a little, then took a pillow and stuffed it behind her waist. Her hair was still wet, so Xieting Zhou untied her hair and used his wide sleeves to soak the water on it bit by bit. The city gate was ablaze with fire, and 2 teams of guards were lined up at the door. Ren Yanji, the captain of the city gate, walked back and forth in front of the gate countless times and looked up countless times. He was called out from his wife's bed. When he heard that Xieting Zhou was leaving the city in the middle of the night, he was so frightened that he ran straight to the city gate. Everyone knew what Xieting's status was in the capital. Prince Balin could not neglect him, but he had to stay in the capital to be safe. Ren Yanji didn't dare to report it, for fear of causing trouble, and also for fear that if Xieting Zhou really ran back to Balin, there wouldn't be enough heads for more than a dozen members of his family. "Boss, here we come," the guard at the city gate shouted excitedly. Ren Yanji looked up and saw a group of people galloping towards them, seemingly in a hurry. 11 Feng and the 2 guards ran ahead and reined up their horses in front of the city gate. "Master Xiao Yi, the prince wants to enter the city, so I hope it will be easier to open the door." He spoke politely and did not hesitate to let Yanji get into trouble, but he did not dare to neglect his duties. Ren Yanji clasped his fists. "It's no problem if the crown prince wants to enter the city, but we must first make sure whether the crown prince himself is in the carriage." Zifeng frowned and was about to speak when he heard Xieting Zhou say from inside the carriage, "It's important to enter the city." Ren Yanji walked to the carriage and said first, "Your Highness, I'm offended." Then he reached out and opened the curtain. This sight shocked Ren Yanji. In the carriage, Xieting Zhou was reclining, holding someone in his arms. The person was tightly wrapped in a cloak, with only his hair hanging loose, and a slender hand exposed from the corner of the cloak. Before Ren Yanji had time to take a closer look, Xieting Zhou's eyes had moved from the face of the person in his arms. "Has Lieutenant Ren confirmed it?" There was a faint smile on his lips, but Ren Yanji felt frightened and hurriedly lowered the curtain. Ren Yanji was not waiting here to embarrass Xieting Zhou, but now he was more willing to give him face. "Open the door." As soon as the door opened, a guard whipped up his horsewhip and rushed out like an arrow from the string, heading to the palace to report the news in advance. The side door of the palace was opened, and the carriage went straight into the palace. It stopped when it approached Kingpiju and could not get in. The doctor was already at Kingpu residence, and Uncle Zhong also got up from his bed in the middle of the night. He thought it was Xieting whose old illness relapsed, but when the curtain was lifted, he actually hugged someone out. Xieting Zhou walked quickly with Shen Yu in his arms. After entering the door, he placed her on his couch. He lowered the curtain with a wave of his hand and ordered the doctor to come in and check his pulse. Along the way, Shen Yu's fever got worse and worse, and there were dry cuts on her lips. Uncle Zhong didn't dare to go in without permission, so he asked Zifeng, "Who is it? Who is your highness carrying back?" 11 Feng said truthfully, "Shijie." Uncle Zhong was mentally prepared, but he staggered in anger and stamped his feet and said, What are you talking about? You're doing evil." Inside the house. After checking the pulse, the doctor said, "Judging from the pulse, it should be that depression has been accumulated for a long time. This person's body is not necessarily very strong, and he relies on perseverance to support him. If the pressure is too much, the depression accumulated in the body will be like closing a gate and blocking a river. Once the spirit is relaxed, the river embankment will burst and it will be violent. It is actually a good thing to burn." Xieting Zhou knew what was going on. She had always been concerned about this case, but now that the verdict was handed down, she relaxed. He looked at Shen Yu's face and asked coldly, "She has been burned to the point where she doesn't know what's going on, so why should she keep burning like this?" The doctor hurriedly said, "Your Highness, don't be anxious. In fact, it is a good thing to have a fever. It is better to relieve the disease than to block it. It is good if the inner fire in the body is dissipated. Otherwise, it may become a serious illness if it is too deep." Xieting Zhou was agitated and his face became very dark. The doctor said, "I will prescribe 2 sets of medicine, one for internal use and one for external use. The external one is boiled into a decoction and soaked in." As he spoke, he walked to the table, picked up a pen and wrote down 2 sets of medicines, then went out and handed them to Zifeng, and gave instructions on how to use the medicines. Xieting Zhou picked up the handkerchief and wiped the sweat from Shen Yu's forehead. After thinking for a moment, he raised his voice and said, "Uncle Zhong." Uncle Zhong was feeling depressed at this moment, wondering if he would one day burn out like Shijie if he continued to feel depressed like this. Hearing His Highness calling him, Uncle Zhong quickly straightened his expression and entered the door. "Your Highness." Xieting Zhou calmly ordered, "Find 2 maids and a more reliable old man brought from Balin." Uncle Zhong asked, "May I ask, Your Highness, what is the use of man?" Xieting Zhou lifted the bed curtain and said, "Take care of her." Uncle Zhong turned his head and looked. "Isn't that a girl lying on the bed? If you take a closer look, you will see that he looks so similar to Shijie." Uncle Zhong almost fell down. "Is this Shijie?" Xieting Zhou said, Uncle Zhong forgot to think for a moment. She is." Xieting Zhou nodded slightly, and seeing Uncle Zhong still standing there blankly, he asked, "Any questions?" "No," Uncle Zhong's voice was like a bell, "absolutely not. I will make arrangements right now, old Zhong." Uncle Zhong went out and looked up at the sky. It was so dark that he couldn't see anything. How could God be so accurate and hit the pie on his head and on the head of Balin Prince's mansion? It turns out that when he was in Beijing, the prince was not close to women. People said that he was just pretending to hang out in a brothel, and he had to change the water 3 times when he came back to bathe. The old prince was worried at the time, and when the prince came to the capital, he was worried that his sleeve would be cut off without saying anything. The old prince once said, "It doesn't matter if your sleeves are broken. The problem is that you can't leave your wife." Now, looking at this, His Royal Highness is keeping silent and has even chosen the future crown princess. Originally, I thought that as the prince was so outstanding, he would definitely find a worthy lady, but now, I am thankful that it is a woman. Uncle Zhong happily arranged the manpower, and soon he brought people over. He exceeded the quota and brought 4 people. The 2 maids, the future crown prince, were too negligent. "Your Highness, people have been brought here." Xieting Zhou walked out of the room, glanced at the maids, and ordered, "Prepare a bathtub and wait for her to bathe. Take care of yourself if you see or hear anything." Uncle Zhong hurriedly said, "Your Highness, don't worry, I have already given instructions when you came, but..." "What?" Xieting Zhou glanced over. Uncle Zhong was a little embarrassed, but he put his face aside and asked in a low voice, "But, won't your Highness come in person to take a bath?" Xieting Zhou. Uncle Zhong was a little embarrassed by his glance. He cleared his throat and said, "I'm a little too hasty. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding." Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 108. After taking a bath, it was already dawn, and several maids retreated. Xieting Zhou sat back on the edge of the bed, and when he touched his forehead, the fever had subsided a little, but it was still burning. She had just taken a bath and changed into clean clothes. Her hair was carefully dried by the maid and spread on the bed. But after a while, beads of sweat began to form on her forehead again, and her fresh and clean clothes began to become moist with sweat. The doctor said that it would be fine if the inner fire comes out. Fever and sweating are normal. She seemed to be lying in discomfort, her breathing became heavier and her brows were knitted together tightly. Xieting Zhou picked her up from the quilt, leaned against him, and wiped the sweat on her forehead bit by bit with a handkerchief. He had never taken care of anyone in his life. Even when he served King Balin, he just brought medicine and poured water. His maids did the rest. But now that he was taking care of her, he felt as if this was what he should do, as if this was what he should do. After an unknown amount of time, Xieting Zhou let her lie back on the bed. When he retracted his hand, the back of his fingers seemed to accidentally scratch her cheek, and Shen Yu suddenly moved on the bed. Xieting Zhou leaned over and asked, "Are you awake?" Shen Yu just turned her head impatiently, looking uncomfortable. It will be uncomfortable, but you have to endure it, Xie Zhou comforted in a low voice. Just as she was about to get up, she found that her sleeve was being held by her, but her eyes were not open. Father! Xie Zhou stared at her sleeves and sighed. She really didn't know how she got into the habit of calling her dad when she was sick. He has been her father twice. It has to start when Shen Yu was a child. Her mother died early and the two children were still young. Shen Zhong'an was worried about leaving the children to his servants. He was both a father and a mother. He took care of himself when he was sick or fell. Shen Yu was in poor health when she was young. She was initially asked to practice martial arts to strengthen her body. Unexpectedly, she had excellent intelligence and strong bones. Practicing kung fu was quite hard. Shen Zhong'an felt sorry for her and said she would stop practicing if she couldn't continue. However, she was stubborn and wanted to be strong, so she insisted on practicing, so she kept practicing. Every time after practice, Shen Yu loves to play coquettishly with Shen Zhong'an and scream in pain. Xie Zhou held her hand and gently put it back under the quilt. He heard her murmur again, "Brother. Brother, this one sounds much more pleasant to the ears." He is several years older than her, so this call is not exaggerated, although he knows that her name is Shen Zhao. The fever lasted for a whole day, and finally calmed down by the evening of the second day. It was early morning when Shen Yu woke up. She was lying on her back on the bed, looking at the curtain on the top of the bed in a daze. This is not her bed. Her bed curtains are white, but this bed curtains are dark cyan. She remembered that she was talking to Xie Zhou on the carriage. What happened next? Shen Yu lifted the bed curtain and took a look. The room was very large, and the furnishings were simple yet elegant. At first glance, it was Xie Zhou's room. She couldn't think of any situation where she would be lying on Xie Zhou's bed. Just as he was thinking about it, a hazy figure was reflected on the screen partition in the middle, slowly walking towards the side. Shen Yu closed her eyes for a moment and kept her sleeping posture. She heard footsteps getting closer and closer, stopping in front of the bed. She heard the curtain being lifted, and then a cool hand touched her forehead. Shen Yu spent a lot of effort to steady herself. After the hand left, Xie Zhou didn't make any move for a while. Xie Zhou stared at her with a smile for a long time, just to see how long she could keep pretending. "Stop pretending, get up and eat something when you wake up." Shen Yu opened her eyes and looked at him. This man really didn't show any dignity to anyone and directly exposed her. Xie Zhou helped her sit up and stuffed a pillow behind her back. She looked down and saw that the clothes on her body belonged to her. She should have picked them up from Lu Mingxian. This action caught Xie Zhou's eyes, and he joked, "Are you worried that I am plotting against you?" Shen Yu hugged the quilt, "I'm worried that I will go crazy because of my illness and plot against you." "Xie Zhou, maybe what you are worried about is what I want." It took Shen Yu a moment to realize the meaning of the sentence. Xie Zhou had already turned around to call someone. She couldn't tell whether the casual sentence was a joke or somewhat serious. The maids filed in carrying trays. Just as Shen Yu was about to get out of bed, Xie Zhou came in from behind the screen and ordered, "Place on the couch." The maid responded, "Yes." He must have just finished cleaning his hands. He took a handkerchief to wipe the water droplets on his hands and watched the maid place a small table on the couch and place the food on the table one by one. "Get down," Xie Zhou ordered. This was Shen Yu's first time eating on the bed, but judging from the maid's proficiency, it was probably not the first time. He must have been lingering on the bed sometimes, and he was probably too weak to even get out of bed. Thinking of this, Shen Yu suddenly felt a little depressed. Xie Zhou sat sideways on the couch, glanced at the dishes, and then rolled up his sleeves to serve the porridge himself. People who are sick usually have no appetite, but Shen Yu felt that she was so hungry that she could eat an elephant. How long have I been asleep? Xieting Zhou placed the porridge bowl in front of her and said, 2 days. 2 days, Shen Yu was shocked. She remembered the verdict. Ji Liangji would be executed in 3 days, and now it had been 2 days. Shen Yu took the chopsticks from Xieting Zhou and asked, will Ji Liangji be beheaded at noon tomorrow? Xieting Zhou said lightly and asked her, do you want some side dishes? Eat. Shen Yu said, but... Xieting Zhou interrupted her, would you like pickles? It's appetizing. Yes, Shen Yu replied casually and said to herself, I actually haven't said anything that night. Xieting Zhou, do you want meatloaf? Yes, Shen Yu was anxious, I. Xieting Zhou, forget it, you are sick now and it will be difficult for the meat pie to be cured. One is anxious and angry, the other is calm and calm. Shen Yu's mind was not on eating at all. She waved her hand and said, forget it, you can eat whatever you want. I've been thinking about it for a long time. Anything is fine. Xieting Zhou suddenly raised his eyes and asked, do you want me? Yes, Shen Yu nodded, and then said, I have thought about it. Since Ji Liangji took over the matter with all his strength, he must have reached a consensus with someone. This person. She spoke slower and slower, and her voice became softer and quieter. From Xieting Zhou's meaningful eyes, she gradually recalled what he had just asked and what she had answered. Her heartbeat gradually accelerated, as if it was about to jump out of her chest uncontrollably. Shen Yu suddenly pressed her chest. Do you feel uncomfortable? Xieting Zhou asked. Shen Yu shook her head. Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes and saw that her fingertips turned white when pinched on the chopsticks. He reached out and took the chopsticks over and stuffed a spoon into her hand. She was so nervous that Xieting Zhou was no longer prepared to say anything else. He said calmly, put Ji Liangji's matter aside for now, fill your stomach first, and I will let you meet someone later. Shen Yu nodded, looking so well behaved, and scooped out a big spoonful of porridge with her head lowered. Just as she was about to stuff it into her mouth, Xieting Zhou grabbed her hand and said, it's hot. Shen Yu couldn't remember exactly what she ate during this meal and how it tasted. She could only stuff it into her mouth. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 109. After dinner, the maid came in to clean up. Shen Yu still remembered Xieting Zhou's words for her to meet someone, and was about to get up and get dressed. No, just be casual. Xieting Zhou turned to the person outside the door and said, let her in. As soon as he finished speaking, a figure jumped into the door, walked around the screen and rushed towards Shen Yu. The man was wearing floral clothes and had a cloth wrapped around his head. Shen Yu almost didn't recognize who it was. Seeing that the man was about to pounce on Shen Yu on the bed, Xieting Zhou glanced at him and the man immediately stopped and stood by the bed, not daring to move. Shen Yu finally saw who it was and said, green medicine. Lu Yao cried out loudly, little, young master. Xieting Zhou said, the people from the escort agency sent her to the palace yesterday and have already visited you once when you were sleeping. With Xieting Zhou around, Lu Yao didn't dare to cry loudly, but only dared to wipe her tears secretly. The green medicine became darker and thinner. Shen Yu felt distressed and reached out to call her over. Lu Yao walked over, took Shen Yu's hand and knelt on the footrest, sobbing and started talking about what happened in the past few months. After Liu Yao left Yan Liangwen last year, she and Hong Qiao worked separately. She was not as quick as Hong Qiao, so she was responsible for running errands, while Hong Qiao went to Hezhu to help Mrs. Lu and collect information. In fact, Liu Yao knew why the lady asked her to deliver the letter instead of Hong Qiao. Because Hong Qiao had liked the eldest young master for a long time, and the eldest young master's body was gone. The lady was worried that Hong Qiao would feel uncomfortable, so she let her go to Hezhu first. Liu Yao went to Shengjing to deliver the letter to Shen Yan. He originally thought he could wait for Shen Yan to reply or leave a message. But after waiting for several days, Shen Yan didn't hear back. Instead, Shen Yan tried to prevaricate her, saying that she was busy with funeral arrangements and asked her to wait. Liu Yao said with indignation, "She asked me to wait. I thought she was being kind, but it turned out that I overheard the lady telling her that she wanted to bury the lady. I asked her why, and she lied to me and said that was what was written in the letter. The envelope was filled with paint." Shen Yan thought that Liu Yao had not read it, but in fact, Shen Yu was worried that Liu Yao was too playful and might lose the letter on the way, so she had already told him about it. Liu Yao was tired of kneeling, so he simply sat down on the footrest, sniffed and said, "Young master, you also know that I am not that smart. I don't understand what it means to stand still, so I got mad on the spot." "How did you send it?" Shen Yu asked. Liu Yao gritted his teeth and said, "I just told you that I would go to Yanliang Pass to find you and ask you to come back and deal with them." "Then what?" "Then they got scared and kept admitting their mistake and even invited me to drink tea." "What happens next?" Shen Yu asked again. Liu Yao blinked, "Then I fainted." Shen Yu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She really didn't know whether to call this child innocent or stupid. "Why are you wearing a towel on your head?" Shen Yu stretched out her hand to lift it, but Liu Yao couldn't even reach out to press it, so she burst into tears. "Under the cloth is short hair." "How short is it?" "Probably less than an inch." Shen Yu was stunned and quickly pushed the towel back to her while comforting her. It's okay, I'll get up soon." They went too far." Liu Yao burst into tears. "Not only did they send me to a nunnery, but some old women also shaved my hair, twice a month, twice, ugh." Xie Tingzhou watched Shen Yu comforting her while holding back laughter, and reminded him, "Don't hold it back." Shen Yu glared at him, and Xie Tingzhou turned away with a smile. "I'll go out first." The nunnery where Shen Yan sent Liu Yao had a mountain gate, and there was no way to go down the mountain except jumping off the cliff. Liu Yao ran away many times but failed to escape until he Sui Wai took someone to pick her up. After Xie Tingzhou went out, Liu Yao wiped his tears and continued, "I heard the madam and the second young lady arguing. It seems that the second young lady didn't agree with it originally, but the madam kept instigating it." "It's not important anymore." Shen Yu shook her head and said. No matter what thoughts Shen Yan had at the beginning, she finally made a choice, but she chose the wrong path because of her weak will, and she will be responsible for the consequences. A spring rain and a warm one. Today the rain stopped, the sun set, and the weather became much warmer. Xie Tingzhou stood under the eaves, with 11 Feng and Chang Lu standing beside him. Chang Liu glanced into the house and saw nothing. "Why did Shiji's girl become like that? I've never seen that flower cloth in the village." Xie Tingzhou glanced sideways at him, and Chang Liu shrank his neck. Zai Feng smiled and said, "That girl knows kung fu, so you're not afraid of being beaten." Chang Liu said, "I can also kung fu, and I have the support of His Highness. Why am I afraid that she is just a girl?" 11 Feng, she also has Xiu's support. Chang Liu thought for a moment and looked at Xie Tingzhou in a sleepy way. "Your Highness." "I can't control it," Xie Tingzhou said, lowered his sleeves and turned around to enter the house. Uncle Zhong walked in from the door and followed the maid who was carrying a tray with several plates of snacks on it. When passing by, Nagaru grabbed the sheep and was slapped on the hand by Tadashi. "This is for Shiji." Chang Liu was stunned. "Grandpa, don't you hate Shiji the most?" Uncle Zhong said solemnly, "That was before, but it's different now." "How is it different?" Zhongbakan glanced at him, and his mind was naturally that the yin and yang of men and women were different. Chang Liu was still a half-year-old child, and everyone in the palace gave way to him, and Uncle Zhong usually loved him more. It was really turned upside down. He squatted down under the pillar, curled his lips and said, "I have fallen out of favor now." Uncle Zhong reprimanded, "Why do you fight for the favor of a man?" Nagaria was dissatisfied, "Shijir is a man too, why not?" "Shijir, she. Uncle Zhong choked and couldn't find a reason for a long time. "She can do it." After saying that, he flicked his sleeves and led the maid through the door. Uncle Zhong asked about his well-being and was very enthusiastic. After finally waiting for Uncle Zhong to leave, Shen Yu finally took a breath. "Does Uncle Zhong know?" Xieting Zhou nodded and said, "If you want to arrange the maids, you have to go through Uncle Zhong's hands. It's good that he knows. Actually, there is no need to arrange a maid as a guard, she still has a maid to serve her. There is no such logic in the world." Xieting Zhou. Seeing that Xieting Zhou's expression was wrong, Shen Yu asked doubtfully, "What's wrong?" Xieting Zhou smiled half-heartedly, "Uncle Zhong also said that we don't need maids. Do you think he is right?" Shen Yu nodded without knowing why, "Yes." Xieting Zhou said, "Then I understand. Next time I take a bath for you, I will definitely not ask the maid to do it. From now on, my son." He paused, stared at her face, leaned closer, and said, "I will serve you personally." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 110. Feeling the breath hitting her cheek, Shen Yu tilted her head back a little, stared into his eyes and asked, "What's wrong with you today?" Xieting Zhou was stunned. Shen Yu had raised her hand to cover his forehead, and then touched her own forehead. He murmured, "Why does it seem that it is me who is burned, but your brain that is damaged?" Xieting Zhou. He stepped back a little and listened for a moment. There was the sound of Chang Lu talking to the doctor outside. He raised his voice and said, "Let the doctor come in and check your pulse." The bed curtain hung down again, and Shen Yu stretched out her hand from under the curtain to let the doctor check her pulse. The gauze tent was half transparent, and she looked at Xieting Zhou's figure on the tent in trance. In fact, just now, she couldn't control her heartbeat for a moment, and it took a lot of effort to calm down. He has been in a high position since he was born. Her Royal Highness has plenty of time and energy to satisfy his whims, but she still has too many things to do. It's good that the internal fire has been burned out. Judging from the pulse condition, it is better now. However, we still need to pay attention to the wind in the past few days to prevent the wind evil from entering the body and making a comeback. Are there any physical discomforts? Shen Yu was brought back to her senses by the doctor's words and said, "No, I just feel a little tired in my muscles and bones." "It shouldn't be," the doctor frowned and thought for a moment before saying, "This symptom is a bit strange." "It's not surprising," Xieting Zhou said calmly, "she can't stop. She gets tired if she doesn't bounce around for a day." Across the curtain, Shen Yu glared at him fiercely, and she didn't know if Xieting Zhou noticed it. The doctor also smiled and stood up and said, "I have just recovered, but I still need to take it step by step. I will prescribe a few more medicines for recovery." As soon as the doctor left, Shen Yu said she wanted to go back to Lu Mingxian. She occupied Xieting Zhou's bed and didn't dare to ask where he had been sleeping these past few days. Xieting Zhou didn't leave her alone, but asked her to go to his study after washing up. Shen Yu changed her clothes and tied her hair up again. She looked more energetic, but her expression was still not good. Walking out of Xieting Zhou's bedroom, he saw Chang Lu under the tree digging for ants. Shen Yu waved and asked Chang Lu to come over. What are you doing? Chang Liu raised his head, his face full of resentment, like a child who no one loved. Shen Yu walked over and squatted beside him, handing him the plate of snacks she had brought out specially. Chang Liu looked at it, swallowed, and didn't answer. Isn't this your favorite food? Do you have any conspiracy? Chang Liu asked. Shen Yu touched his head and said, who said you have fallen out of favor? Everyone loves you, and I love you too. Chang Liu then curled his lips and took it. Looking at Shen Yu's back as she stood up and left, he suddenly realized that Shijie was only 1 year older than him, so how could he treat him like a child? So Yang Sheng shouted from behind, Shijie, you took advantage of me. Shen Yu stepped into Xie Ting's study. She had been here many times and was no stranger to it. Xie Ting stood behind the desk, raised his eyes to look at her after hearing the sound, then lowered his eyes, come and take a look. Shen Yu walked over and saw a portrait on the case, which could not be seen clearly when turned upside down. She walked around to Xie Ting again. Who is this? Xie Ting looked at the portrait and said, the old man Sanfu mentioned was painted by an artist after Sanfu described it. 3 of the 4 people who came from Kikane Mansion died, and only 1 old man was missing. There must be something wrong with that old man, and he might be a breakthrough. Shen Yu stared at the portrait for a long time, then shook her head and said, I haven't seen it before, but I can make the clerks at Lu's shop recognize it. Xie Ting nodded. Lu's shops are spread all over the country, and her eyes are everywhere, which is a lot more convenient. Shen Yu wants to move back to Lu Mingxian, but the one who opposes the most is Uncle Zhong. After trying hard to talk to no avail, he insisted on giving her a few maids. Shen Yu didn't want any of them. Now that Lu Yao was back, Lu Yao and area were enough. Besides, it would be inconvenient to do things with so many people. The sun was setting and the sky was getting dark. Liu Yao and area both went to bed. When the bang sounded for the 3rd time, Shen Yu got up from the bed, took out a pair of night clothes from the back of the cabinet and put them on. There were daggers hidden in his waist and boots, and potions in his purse for emergencies. After taking care of everything and making sure nothing was left behind, Shen Yu opened the window and jumped up to the eaves one by one. She was already familiar with where there would be someone on duty in the palace, and when the duty would change. The night clothes melted into the night, looking like a ghost. He avoided the night watchers and came out of the palace in a few moments. Your Highness's guess was so accurate. Shijie really came out from here. Shen Yu was crossing the wall when she suddenly heard the sentence and almost lost her balance when she landed. She held her hand on the wall and looked at the dark alley, where there were many shadows, and then light came on. There were more than a dozen guards lined up in a row, each with a stern expression, and they looked like they were here to catch a thief. Xie Ting stood in the middle, wearing a cyan robe. The cloud pattern on the edge of the robe was reflected by the lantern. He was truly peerless and independent. But Shen Yu had no intention of admiring it at the moment. She thought about how she was so unlucky to be caught by Xie Ting, and also thought about how the palace was so big. How could he guess that she was going to come out from here? Could it be that he was a roundworm in her stomach? Xie Ting stared at her intently. After a while, he took a step forward. Shen Yu felt like she was facing a formidable enemy and struck before he spoke, you don't have to persuade me. Ji Liangji will be executed tomorrow. I have to go this time. If I use my full strength, these brothers may not be able to stop me. Xie Ting looked worried, do you think Ji Liangji will open his mouth? Since he killed him in one bite during the palace trial, how can he open his mouth easily? You have to give it a try, Shen Yu said seriously, you won't regret it if you give it a try. She just had the temperament to never look back. Xie Ting knew that even if Ji Liangji didn't say anything when she went, she would try her best, but if she didn't go, she would always think about it in her heart. Just like he once told her, but with a clear conscience. Xieting Zhou sighed softly and stopped when he walked in front of her. How are you going to go, he said in a deep tone, breaking into Dali Temple at night. Do you know where Ji Liangji is currently being held? How many more people did Dali Temple send for this? Shen Yu said, let's give it a try. I have a way to escape unscathed. Xieting Zhu's jaw tightened, what can I do? Shen Yu said nothing. Xieting Zhou took a deep breath and lowered his voice, when will you learn to trust me? Shen Yu suddenly looked up. He was standing with his backlight. Shen Yu couldn't see his expression clearly, but she could tell that he was very angry, even helpless and disappointed. Shen Yu bit her lower lip, but her mind was still calm. After all, it's getting late, I have to go early, let's talk about it when we get back, okay? She finally gave in and asked him to discuss it with him. Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes to look at her, and saw a carriage clattering in the darkness. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 111. Xieting Zhou got on the carriage first, then straightened up when he bent down to get in. He turned around and said, since it's late, I haven't come up yet. Shen Yu forced herself to follow and got into the carriage, only to see Xieting Zhou raise his hand and throw a set of clothes towards her. Shen Yu quickly caught it and was startled when she saw what was in her hand. She immediately raised her head to look at his face. Xieting Zhou turned his face slightly to the other side, leaving Shen Yu with a cold side face. She looked at the jailer's clothes in her hand and finally understood where his words "when will you learn to trust me" come from. He wasn't here to stop her, he had already taken care of everything for her and paved a safer and smoother road. Xieting Zhou couldn't explain how he felt at this moment. He thought that after so long, she was already trying to believe her, but she still chose to fight alone. Shen Yu touched the jailer's clothes with her fingers, from the rough material to the softness in Xieting Zhu's heart. Along the way, he helped her so much that it was difficult to express gratitude into one word. She opened her mouth, but suddenly she didn't know what to say. After a while, Xieting Zhou said, change on first, Dali Temple is almost here. Shen Yu came back to her senses. She was thin and put on the jailer's clothes. She looked much taller. The carriage was so arrogant that it stopped before it reached Dali Temple. Xieting Zhou said quietly, I'll wait for you where you are. Come out early. Shen Yu, okay, an hour and a half, oh no, I'll be out in an hour at most. Xieting Zhou nodded slightly, and when she was about to open the curtain and go out, he suddenly grabbed her hand. Shen Yu suddenly turned around and looked at her wrist, what's wrong? Let's talk when you come back, Xieting Zhou said warmly. Shen Yu didn't know what he was going to talk about, but her heart couldn't stop getting nervous. Xieting Zhou pinched her wrist lightly and said, don't be afraid. Everything has been prepared inside. Just follow them in. Shen Yu nodded, got out of the carriage and looked back again, then, I'm leaving. A smile appeared on Xieting Zhu's lips, well, let's go. Just ahead is near Guang'e Gate. Shen Yu followed the jailer who came to meet him and showed her waist badge in front of the yamen. However, Shen Yu couldn't help but look back at the palace alley and the darkness. The carriage was no longer visible, but she felt as if there was a pair of eyes that had been watching her silently. After being reborn, she felt so confident for the first time. It was the time for the jailers to take turns. The guard at the door checked their badges and let people in. As expected, Dali Temple sent more manpower, one person at 3 steps and one post at 5 steps, to defend Dali Temple impregnably. If she decided to go on a night spree tonight, it would be difficult to see Ji Liangji without alerting the guards. After entering the Dali Temple prison, the guards inside became much more lax, probably because they thought that with the security outside, not even a fly could come in. The jailer took Shen Yu to the door of a cell and whispered, Brother, please forgive me, we can only go here. The key to the cell door is in our hands. Shen Yu nodded and said, excuse me. Ji Liangji did not sleep. Tomorrow at noon would be when his head hit the ground. He leaned against the wall and thought, his life was not too bad, it was just that he overturned the car at the end of the day. Hearing the voices at the door, Ji Liangji asked, at this time, who else wants to take my life? Shen Yu looked at the man in the prison, I'm not here to take your life. Ji Liangji tugged at the hem of his clothes and said, then you are here to ask the truth. No. What is that? Ji Liangji asked strangely. You'll know when you see it. Ji Liangji glanced towards the cell door. The light was dim and he couldn't see the person clearly. I saw the man taking the torch from the wall and slowly approaching, and his face finally appeared in the light. Ji Liangji rubbed his eyes and his expression suddenly changed. You are Shen Yu. But haven't you already? Just think of me as dead. In fact, she and Ji Liangji had not met each other a few times. They only met 2 or 3 times when he met Shen Zhongan, so they were not familiar with each other. Shen Yu put the torch back again. I came here today to get an answer for my father and brother. I want to ask you for him, why did you do this? Ji Liangji lowered his head and said nothing. Shen Yu said, my father is an out-and-out military general. He has a straightforward personality and will not give in to others. The friends he considers are heart-to-heart friends. Obviously he is a heart-to-heart friend, but you are not. Ji Liangji lowered his head and said nothing. Shen Yu added, I can't let their death be in vain. Ji Liangji suddenly raised his head and whispered, Auntie, I remember your father called you that. Even when a person is about to die, his words are kind. Listen to me, don't investigate this case anymore, just look into it further. If you go down, you will be killed. I am someone who has died once, Shen Yu said calmly, death is not so scary, only having an uneasy conscience is scary. Why are you as stubborn as your father? Ji Liangji shook his head and said, isn't it good to live well? Shen Yu said, I also want to ask you, can you rest in peace if you die without justice? Ji Liangji has aged a lot. He is obviously only in his 50s, but he looks like he is in his 70s or 80s. There is no one else, I said it in the Book of Sinners, it is all I do. Do you think I will believe it? Shen Yu asked, do you think my father will believe it? In fact, I met Liang Jianfang before he died. He told me that there were other spies in the army who did not know each other, but you said it was him who colluded with the Zihu people. You are obviously lying. Tell me, Uncle Ji. Shen Yu held onto the cell door, I beg you to tell me. Ji Liangji looked at her, his expression moved for a moment. He didn't know what he thought of, but he still shook his head, I can't say too much, or in other words, I don't know as much as you think. There are 3 strategies in total. One is to collude with the Western Jew, and the other is to provide food and grass. I didn't expect that the first 2 strategies were resolved by you. Closing the city gate is the last resort, because once Shen Zhongan returns to Beijing, he has 100,000 troops. This matter will not be investigated. It's impossible to stop the situation, and they can't let him investigate. Shen Yu tightened her grip on the wooden railing, what kind of hatred could make them be so cruel? Ji Liangji shook his head, maybe you were on the wrong track from the beginning. Maybe the reason why you killed Shen Zhongan in the first place was not for other reasons, but because some people wanted to protect themselves. Shen Yu was stunned, but she didn't have much time to think. Ji Liangji continued, I used my life and a secret to save the lives of more than 1,000 members of the Ge family. It is worth it? No matter how much, I can't say more. Go underground and I will apologize to your father. But how can you guarantee that the other party will not go back on your word after you die? Ji Liangji suddenly smiled, I left a life-saving charm for my children. Even if I die, as long as the life-saving charm is still there, they will not dare to act rashly. Shen Yu wanted to ask again, but the jailer's voice suddenly came from the other end of the cell. Sleep, it would be nice if I had a knife to burn my mouth at this time. Shen Yu frowned. This was the secret signal that the prison chief had said in advance, indicating that the situation had changed.